Okay, we spent our time this past Sunday focusing on the role of husband. And really, because there's so much that we could unpack in this particular role, we focused on the idea of making sure that we kind of broke it down into uh, his role in leading and his role in loving. Now, we spent our time in Ephesians chapter 5, very obvious choice there, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. And his role as in loving is commanded in verse 25, and his role in leading is clearly stated and described in verse 23. And then are both of which are expanded on the next few verses. So let's just run through a few of the ideas we talked about as from the aspect of him loving his wife, the husband loving his wife. So first of all, it is patterned after Christ's love. In verse 25, it says uh, that husbands love your wives even as Christ loved the church. This means that properly loving your wife, husbands, can only be done by a spirit-filled husband. And that role or that love then is expressed sacrificially. It says, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So questioning whether or not that love is costing something is very important. Husband has to be willing to give up his own rights, his own desires, as he loves his wife properly. That love is also very purposeful. And the Bible says here in verse 27 that the reason for Christ's love, or the plan for that, was to wash her so that he might present her blameless, right? And so that love of a husband towards a wife needs to be driven in her spiritual well-being. Has to have that purpose in the love. Of course, in verse 28 and 29, we also see that at minimum, it is uh, more than self love. He says, no man ever hated his own self. And that's not just the idea of no abuse. Certainly, that's a bare minimum. But he uses the phrase nourish and cherish, right? Nourish means to build up, cherish means to care for or value. And so these should be ideas that describe the love that the husband has for his wife. And then, really, just wrapping it up, it's an act of the will. It's not a feeling. It's not based on anything that the wife is doing. John chapter 3 and verse 16 says, God so loved the world that he gave. And it's not that he was forced into giving or that he gave begrudgingly, but he gave because he loved. And it just happens when we love properly. And so we focused first on the aspect of the husband's love, but also it's very clear that the husband should be leading his wife, his spouse. And of course, if he's not loving his spouse properly, then he's going to have a very difficult time leading his spouse properly. And that leading is focused on the spiritual health of his wife, his family, which means he has to have his own personal relationship at first. He can't lead in a spiritual way when he does not have a spiritual connection. Regular and active in a local church. Remember, more is caught than taught. First Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8 points out that this is as well a leading that cares for the physical needs of the family, not just the spiritual needs of the family from that aspect. And then in First Timothy chapter 3, he uses the word several times, rule, which is often misinterpreted, and it's really more about managing. And so that is making sure that the success of the family unit is priority. That is what leading looks like. And then First Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, Peter points out to us that husbands need to have their brains in gear. He uses the phrase, dwell with them according to knowledge. So husband needs to be learning about his wife and learning her likes and dislikes, and learning her desires, and learning what makes her happy, learning what makes her upset. These things. We'll call it CPE for the marriage. Husbands certainly have plenty of time spent in continuing education around their maybe their job or their profession. but do we husbands spend time learning our wives as well? And so it's just important for us to understand and be clear that the husband's role has these two aspects of leading and loving. And those are not just positions, but they're actions. And that is what it takes to be a husband that is godly.